Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another fantastic episode of Captain Patriotic. How's everybody doing? If you tuned in last time, you may recall that I talked in great detail about the most decorated Air Force pilot to serve during the Korean War, and that particular honor went to none other than Major George Andrew Davis, Jr. If you didn't by chance tune in last time, I highly recommend that you do it because he was quite an individual and he served a lot of time in the cockpit for sure and paid the ultimate sacrifice for the better. Not to spoil anything, but please check out that last video. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit today and focus on the most decorated U.S. Navy veteran to serve during the Korean War. And ironically, he is another pilot. That particular honor goes to none other than Captain Thomas Hudner, Jr. That's right, you guys. A naval pilot is the most decorated U.S. Navy veteran of the Korean War, with the most prestigious honors, of course. This is not to diminish any service members that served during Korea. There's plenty of heroes out there that don't tell their full stories or ever get a chance to tell their stories for that matter. But today I'm happy to bring you this wonderful tale of heroism and encouragement and selflessness. The story that I'm about to tell you, it may seem fake or it may seem like Hollywood-esque, but I assure you this is based on plenty of research and real-life accounts that this actually happened. What I'm about to tell you guys can actually be seen in a recent war movie that came out a couple of years ago called Devotion, which stars Glenn Powell, who you may know from other recent movies like Top Gun Maverick, as well as his opposite lead of Jonathan Majors, which starred in recent movies like the Creed franchise. Anyway, these guys serve as the real-life pilots during the early stages of the Korean War. If you have never seen this movie, I highly recommend you guys take a look at it and watch it whenever you have a chance. I was thoroughly blown away by how impactful of a story it was, and I often think it's overlooked by many war movies today. But all of this to say, the story that I'm about to tell you guys, in my mind's eye, has to be one of, if not the greatest personal attempt to rescue somebody in U.S. military history. I mean, the guts that somebody had to have to pull off this stunt is incredible. And we'll get into it in much more detail here shortly. Now, for those of you that may not be super familiar with the structure and the different parts of the military, you may be surprised to know that most of the military branches actually have their own aviation section. Not just the Air Force, even though they are the OG kings of warfare in the air, of course. But with that being said, each military branch in their aviation section serves a unique and different purpose that is geared toward that specific branch. Like U.S. Army aviation, for example, it's often used to scout out troop activity, try to figure out where to send in infantry units, as well as to engage the enemy from afar. It's mostly for planning and logistical purpose, as where you switch gears and air units in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps are a totally different story. Like, take the Navy, for example. The primary focus of the U.S. Navy is to basically protect all of our U.S. assets and ships that are floating at sea throughout different parts of the world. Now, sometimes U.S. Navy air units, they often engage enemy from time to time, especially if it's to support like other infantry soldiers and Marines and other service members that are on the ground, such as in this story that we're about to talk to today. They only do that on occasion, or like if they need to insert their special forces units like a SEAL team behind enemy lines. Now, the U.S. Marine Corps, their primary focus of their aircraft is to provide one-on-one close, very, very close air support to their fellow Marine infantrymen on the ground, and to basically engage the enemy to provide cover for those infantry Marines. But anyway, I could go on and on about all the different roles of military aviation in the different branches, but the important thing to know of today is Thomas Hudner. He basically served as a de facto fighter pilot for the U.S. Navy during the early months of the Korean conflict. Thomas Hudner is the only U.S. naval aviator to receive the Medal of Honor during the Korean conflict. That's right, he is the only naval aviator to ever receive the highest medal that a U.S. military member can earn. And it was all for actions that he took one day in December of 1950 whenever he was trying to rescue his wingman, a fellow pilot by the name of Jesse L. Brown, during the famous Battle of the Chosin Reservoir during December of 1950. So guys, our story begins on August 31st, 1924, whenever Thomas Hudner Jr. was born in Fall River, Massachusetts, to a large family. He would spend most of his entire early childhood and teen life in Massachusetts, where he would go on to attend a number of schools, including the Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, and later during high school and college, he would go on to attend the U.S. Naval Academy and enlist in the U.S. Navy. Now, whenever he does enlist in the Navy at the close of World War II, he didn't exactly know what he wanted to do exactly. He just thought he'd go work on a ship or whatever. It wasn't until the conclusion of World War II that he became interested in naval aviation. Now, after a few years of flight training and all of that, he became a certified naval pilot and would go on to join Fighter Squadron 32, where throughout his time in Korea, he would be flying the famous F-4U Corsair. And he actually would fly off of the carrier, the USS Leyte, for his whole deployment to Korea. Now, before we get into the details about his exploits and everything, I want to give you just a tiny bit more background history about Korea. Whenever the Korean War broke out on June 25th, 1950, a big meeting was called for all the members of the United Nations, and basically they voted to send military and ground forces to prevent the total collapse of South Korea after North Korea invaded their border that same month. Now, in response to this call for forces to be deployed to Korea, the Americans, they were more than able to send their tiny, at that time, reserve ground forces in Japan to help combat the North Koreans, which at that time included the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet, which comprised of many different task forces, but the one that Hudner was a part of was Task Force 77. Now, Task Force 77 was led by the fleet carrier, the USS Valley Forge, and between U.S. naval ships and British Navy ships of the Far East Fleet, they were able to provide somewhat adequate air and naval support to the South Koreans as they tried to drive off North Korean forces. And although both navies were able to blockade North Korea and to launch aircraft to delay North Korean forces, early on, UN and American forces knew that this would not be enough to stop the North Korean army from basically taking over the whole peninsula. And it was during that time that President Harry Truman would go on to have a more forceful order of ground troops to be deployed from America into the country to basically offset any air and naval support that was going on at the time. Now, at this particular point, and it's about July 1950, all U.S. Navy units and ships, including the USS Leyte, where Thomas Hudner was stationed on, were placed on high alert, basically saying like, hey, depending on how the war progresses, we may have to force you guys to go serve in Korea and provide support after all. And for the first month or so of the conflict, there was no news of the USS Leyte having to go to Korea to provide support. In fact, during that whole first part of the conflict, the ship was actually deployed in the Mediterranean Sea, where Hudner and other Navy pilots did not expect to be deployed to Korea at all. Heck, it was way on the other side of the world after all. And that remained true for the most part until August 8th of 1950, whenever the USS Leyte and all of its crew members were ordered to Korea to provide support for the ongoing conflict in Korea. Now, this was kind of a shocking decision, and a lot of the crew members on that ship, including Hudner, didn't know it at the time, but naval commanders in Korea and in America at the time felt like the pilots on the Leyte were far better trained and prepared for air combat than those of other available carriers. So essentially, they were chosen to go be deployed to Korea because they thought they were basically one of the best naval air units that there were at the time. Now, it took the Leyte a good couple of months to basically sail from the Mediterranean all the way to Korea, halfway on the other side of the world, where it ultimately landed in Korean waters on October 8th, 1950. And as soon as the USS Leyte and its crew arrived in Korean waters, they joined Task Force 77 off of the very northeast coast of the Korean Peninsula, basically in North Korean territory for the most part. Now, the USS Leyte was a part of a fleet of 17 ships from the U.S. 7th Fleet, which included other notable ships, including the aircraft carrier the USS Philippine Sea, the battleship USS Missouri, and the cruiser the USS Juno, all famous ships from World War II that were put back into service for Korea. Once everybody gets organized and everything, Hudner and the other Navy pilots in these ships, they were flown through different combat missions to basically help support ground forces in Korea. But it wasn't just close air support that these guys were responsible for on all these missions. Of the 20 missions that Hudner flew during Korea, his missions included a wide variety of things, including attacking enemy communication lines, big patches of enemy troop concentrations, as well as other enemy military installations around different towns. This goes on for a good month and a half, or 2 months, and what have you. And at this point in October and November of 1950, basically UN and US forces had pretty much driven North Korea all the way back up past the 38th parallel, which separates the two Koreas, and pretty much all the way up into the very northern part of North Korea. It was at this point in November of 1950 that North Korea's ally, China, felt very uncomfortable because the UN forces were basically at their back door, and they felt like they could invade it pretty much at any time. So it was during Thanksgiving in late November of 1950 where China joins the Korean War on the side of North Korea. And that, my friends, would lead to probably the most iconic Korean War battle that you've probably heard of, the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. The Chosin Reservoir was the first major offensive against U.S. Marines and other UN forces that were trapped in the Chosin Reservoir area. It's kind of like a big bowl of sorts where there was only one way in and one way out. It's an iconic battle, you guys. Just read it up on it. It's actually, not only is it a famous military battle in the Korean War, but it's also a very famous U.S. Marine Corps battle. It's very deep in Marine Corps lore. Once the Chinese entered the Korean War in late November of 1950, Hudner and his squadron were dispatched to the Chosin Reservoir, where the intense campaign was being fought between the 10th U.S. Army Corps and the 1st Marine Division against the People's Volunteer Army, the Chinese 9th Army. Almost 100,000 Chinese troops had surrounded some 15,000 U.S. troops, and the pilots on the Late T were responsible for flying dozens of close air support missions to prevent the Chinese from basically overwhelming and taking over the area. Now, fast forward a little bit to the early part of December 1950, and specifically on December 4th, 1950, where Hudner was part of a 6-aircraft flight that was supporting U.S. Marine ground forces trapped by Chinese forces. At approximately 13:38 or 1:38 regular time, he took off from the Late T with Squadron Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander Dick, forgive me for mispronouncing this, Dick C. Voley, Lieutenant George Hudson, Lieutenant Junior Grade Billy Coing, Ensign Ralph E. McQueen, and his wingman, and the first African-American naval aviator, Ensign Jesse L. Brown, where all these pilots traveled 100 miles from their ship's location to the Chosin Reservoir, flying some 35 to 40 minutes through very harsh wintry weather. The flight began searching for targets along the west side of the reservoir, and they lowered their altitude to some 700 feet in the process. This 3-hour search and destroy mission was also considered an attempt to probe Chinese troop strength in the area. Now, although all of this was going on, the flight had spotted no Chinese soldiers, and around 1440, Coing radioed to Jesse Brown that he appeared to be trailing fuel. Now, there's a lot of speculation for what had happened at this point, but it is most likely that the damage came from small arms fire from Chinese infantry who were engaging American forces at the time, and were also known to hide in the snow and ambush any passing aircraft by firing at that airplane. So, after all this happened, it was concluded that at least one bullet had ruptured Brown's fuel line. Now, at this point, Brown was losing not only fuel pressure, but also control of his aircraft in a snow-covered clearing on the south side of that mountain. It was then that he knew something was going on, and ultimately Brown ended up crashing his F-4U Corsair in 15-degree weather. Like, that's not even chill factor. That is like harsh weather already. The aircraft ultimately broke up violently upon impact and was thus destroyed. And through the crash, Brown's leg was pinned beneath the fuselage of his Corsair, where he originally stripped off his helmet and gloves in an attempt to try to free himself, before waving to the other pilots who were circling close overhead. It was at this point that Hudner and other pilots thought Brown had died in the crash, and they immediately began a mayday radio to any heavy transport aircraft in the area as they canvassed the mountain for any sign of nearby Chinese forces. And they finally, after a few minutes, they received a signal from a rescue helicopter that said it would be there as soon as possible. But at this point, Brown's aircraft was smoking and a fire had started near its internal fuel tanks. Essentially, it was getting more dire for Brown, and they didn't know if they were going to be able to rescue him or not. Now, at this point, Thomas Hudner, he sees his wingman is down on the ground, and he's basically wounded. He breaks formation, and he goes, and he does everything that he can to get to his wingman. I mean, and mind you, whenever Hudner touches down close to where Jesse is, it's in the middle of a firefight, running to Brown's side and attempting to wrestle him free from the wreckage himself. With Brown's condition worsening by the minute, Hudner attempted to drown the aircraft in the snow and pull Brown from the aircraft, all in vain. Brown then began slipping in and out of consciousness, but in spite of being in great pain, did not complain to Hudner. Now, that rescue helicopter arrived at the scene about 20 minutes later, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where Hudner and its pilot, U.S. Marine Lieutenant Charles Ward, kept trying in vain to put the engine fire out with a fire extinguisher as well as other snow they could find. And they also tried to get the fire out as well as free Brown with an axe for another good 45 minutes to an hour. It was intense, you guys. I mean, they did not know what to do. They were basically scrambled to do any little thing they can to try to rescue their friend out of this dire predicament. And they literally did everything they could, and even with all the gunfire going on, it's still trying in vain. Now, after they did all of this, both of the pilots briefly considered at Brown's request to amputate his trapped leg, but it was after this that Brown lost consciousness for the last time and ultimately passed away. Brown's ultimate last words, which he told Hudner, were, "Tell Daisy, his wife, I love her." The Marine helicopter, which was unable to operate in the darkness, was forced to leave at nightfall with Hudner on board, leaving Brown behind and thus to perish. There is many speculation and facts to show that they believe Brown died shortly after they left from his injuries, as well as hypothermia from the extreme cold. Now, fortunately for them, no Chinese forces threatened the site, likely because of the heavy air presence of other naval pilots at the time. Now, you could only imagine the frustration and the sheer disappointment that Hudner felt at this point. Like, he really felt like he let his wingman down, and he felt like he was a failure at everything. In fact, there was many times that Hudner begged his superiors to allow him to return to the wreckage to help extract Brown, but he was ultimately not allowed to, as other naval officers feared an ambush of the helicopters would result in even more deaths than ever that they could afford. So, what was ultimately decided, in order to prevent the body and the aircraft from falling into enemy hands, the Navy bombed the crash site with napalm 2 days later, where the air crewmen recited the Lord's Prayer over the radio as they watched the flames consume Brown's body. With all this being said and done, the remains of both Brown and his aircraft were ultimately never recovered. Thus, Brown became the first African-American Navy officer to be killed in the Korean War. You can only imagine, with everything going on, that has to be overwhelming for everybody. And because of that incident on December 4th, the Navy grounded Hudner for a month because he injured his back in the landing trying to basically save his best friend. Now, a month later, in January of 1951, he would be recalled to active duty service, where he would fly some 27 combat missions during the war until January 20th of 1951, whenever the USS Leyte was rotated back to the Atlantic Fleet. Thus, his tour was over. Now, his actions on that particular night and day did not go unrecognized, and unbeknownst to Hudner, but one of his naval commanders on the Leyte had personally recommended him for the Medal of Honor. It was a few months later, on April 13th, 1951, where Hudner would officially receive the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman, where he would meet Brown's widow, Daisy Brown, that same day. And it was because of that meeting that they would stay in contact for at least 50 more years following that particular meeting. Just because Thomas Hudner was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions on that day, he was not the only one recognized for courageous actions. Jesse Brown, his wingman, would posthumously be awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross as well as a Purple Heart Medal for his service and sacrifice in Korea, whereas the helicopter pilot that assisted Hudner in the rescue, Marine Lieutenant Charles Ward, would go on to receive the Silver Star Medal for his heroism in attempting to help a fellow pilot in need. Besides the Medal of Honor, other medals that Hudner would receive for his service in Korea includes 2 Air Medals as well as a Bronze Star Medal, in addition to the Korean Service Medal, the Korean Presidential Unit Citation, the United Nations Korea Medal, and the Korean War Service Medal. And after receiving the Medal of Honor, Hudner was transferred to the United States and served as a flight instructor at the Naval Air Station in Corpus Christi, Texas, between 1952 and 1953. His next assignment after this was him serving as a staff officer for Carrier Division 3, which was part of the famous Task Force 77 and operated around Japan after the war ended in 1953 and 1954. And then between 1955 and 1956, he served in Air Development Squadron 3 at Naval Air Station in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where he flew developmental and different experimental aircraft. During this time, he would be trained on new jet-powered aircraft. Now, during the 1950s, he basically was trying to get any kind of flying gig that he could get his hands on, and he basically had his wishes fulfilled for him, because beginning in October of 1957, he served in an exchange program with the U.S. Air Force, where he flew for over 2 years with the 60th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts. During this particular assignment, he flew a couple of experimental aircraft, which included the F-94 Starfire and the F-101 Voodoo. He was then promoted to commander and served as aide to the Chief of Bureau of Naval Weapons until 1962, when he attended the Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base, located in Montgomery, Alabama. Upon graduating from this program in July of 1963, he returned to flying duty and was appointed the executive officer of Fighter Squadron 53, flying the F-8E Crusader aboard the USS Ticonderoga. His last peacetime assignment was in 1965, whenever he was promoted to captain and taking command of the Training Squadron 24 at Naval Air Station Chase Field in B County, Texas. You see, at this time, the Vietnam War was really erupting, and more troops were being deployed to Vietnam as it was. I mean, it was only a matter of time before he would be deployed himself. In 1966, due to the response of Vietnam, he was assigned to the USS Kitty Hawk, first as a navigator on the planes, then as the ship's executive officer, where the Kitty Hawk would be deployed off the shore of South Vietnam in 1966 and 1967, where he was responsible for launching missions in support of Vietnam War efforts, where he served on the ship during his tour but saw no combat and flew none of the missions himself. In 1968, after this deployment, he was assigned as the operations officer for the Southeast Asia Air Operations Division of the U.S. Navy. Hudner's final Navy posting was as the head of aviation technical training in the Office of Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C., a post which he held until his retirement from the Navy in February of 1973. Now, it was for his service in Vietnam that Hudner would be awarded the Legion of Merit, as well as a U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Now, after retiring, Hudner initially worked as a management consultant and later worked with the United Service Organizations. And because of his Medal of Honor, he worked regularly with various veteran groups in his retirement as a leader in the veterans community. Other than that, he led a relatively quiet life. In fact, from 1991 until 1999, he served as commissioner for the Massachusetts Department of Veterans Services. And after 1991, he lived in Concord, Massachusetts with his wife, Georgia, and it was some 22 years later, in July of 2013, where he visited Pyongyang, North Korea, in an attempt to recover Jesse Brown's remains from the crash site. Unfortunately, he was told by North Korean authorities to return in September of 2013, when the weather would become more predictable. Nothing has been said whether he recovered Brown's remains or not, but at least he attempted to get his best friend back whatsoever. After that, he led a relatively quiet life until his untimely passing in his home on November 13th, 2017, at the ripe old age of 93. He was ultimately interned at Arlington National Cemetery on April 4th, 2018, in a ceremony attended by General Joseph Durning, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This story is very inspiring because it just shows you how selfless somebody can be to help his or her best friend out in a time of need. And Thomas Hudner certainly tried to do that for Jesse Brown. And he did it well above and beyond the call of duty. I mean, he did everything in the book that he could to try to rescue his best friend. And to me, that speaks volumes of his character, because that shows you not only how selfless he was, but how caring he was for others, to say the least. Man, his tale of doing this in the middle of gunfire and all that in behind enemy lines, that is mind-boggling, y'all. I mean, I don't know of hardly anybody that would do that to this day, but his story is so inspiring, you guys. I cannot imagine being him in the moment right there. So, guys, I really hope you enjoyed my story and tales of Thomas Hudner. And please, whenever you get an opportunity, catch my other videos and see the content that you've missed. And please, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and always stick around for next time. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.